You woke up this morning and walked to the kitchen to eat breakfast. Around noon, an invisible cue prompted you to look for lunch. Tonight, you will sit down for dinner. You have done this your entire life, treating the cycle of 3 meals a day as a fundamental law of human biology. It feels entirely organic, as natural as breathing or the setting of the sun. But almost no one pauses to ask a critical question. Who decided this schedule for you? It was not prescribed by a physician. It was not inherited from ancient biological necessity. The 3-meal structure is not a universal truth etched into human DNA. It is a social construct, an organizational narrative engineered by history, religion, and economics. We do not eat 3 times a day because our bodies demand it. We eat 3 times a day because the modern world demands a predictable human being. To understand how we became trapped within the parameters of the clock, we must journey back to a time before timekeeping existed. 23,000 years ago, along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, a community lived at a site known to modern archaeologists as Ohallo II. Excavations revealed simple dwellings centered around stone hearths, surrounded by the charred remnants of over 140 distinct varieties of seeds, nuts, and animal bones. These people were hunter-gatherers. Their survival depended entirely on the unpredictable rhythms of nature. They did not have breakfast, lunch, or dinner because they had no guaranteed food supply. On some days, a successful forage or a fortunate hunt resulted in an abundance of nourishment, leading to communal feasting. On other days, the landscape offered nothing, forcing them to endure prolonged periods of hunger. To these ancestors, the conceptual framework of a fixed daily eating schedule would have been completely meaningless. Food was not a scheduled routine. It was a direct consequence of immediate effort and environmental availability. The first profound transformation in the human relationship with food occurred around 10,000 before Common Era, with the birth of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. When humans learned to domesticate crops and animals across the territories of modern-day Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, the existential anxiety of the chase subsided. For the first time, food stayed put. Because the food supply became anchored to a specific piece of land, human communities abandoned their nomadic existence and built permanent settlements. Culinary practices grew more intricate, and eating transformed into a collective social ritual. Yet, even with the emergence of agricultural stability, the 3-meal structure remained non-existent. When people ate and how often they ate was still entirely dictated by local culture, geographic realities, and the natural availability of daylight. Consider the civilization of ancient Egypt, which provides some of our earliest documentation of organized eating habits. The citizens of the Nile Valley typically structured their day around 2 distinct meals. They began with a light morning refreshment, consisting primarily of bread and beer, followed by a much more substantial, heavy meal in the evening where they consumed vegetables, lentils, and whatever proteins were available. This was a 2-meal society. Across the Mediterranean, the ancient Greeks designed a system that superficially resembles our modern routine, but lacked its rigid temporal enforcement. They consumed a small morning snack called akrotisma, which was little more than hard bread softened by wine. This was followed by ariston, a midday repast, and concluded with deepnon, a prolonged evening gathering centered around community and philosophical discussion. However, participation in all 3 was fluid. These were not fixed, synchronized events, and the choice to eat was bound to personal leisure rather than an institutional whistle. The most striking historical divergence belongs to the Roman Empire, an ancient superpower celebrated for its extraordinary administrative efficiency and rigorous structural organization. One might logically assume that a civilization capable of engineering massive aqueducts and standardized military legions would enforce a precise, multi-meal schedule. The reality was precisely the opposite. The Romans were deeply suspicious of consuming food more than once a day. To eat multiple meals within a 24-hour cycle was viewed by Roman philosophers and medical practitioners as a form of moral weakness and physical gluttony. They were intensely preoccupied with the mechanics of digestion, believing that the human body operated at its highest intellectual and physical capacity when it was not constantly processing nutrients. Their entire society revolved around a single primary meal known as the cena, which was consumed around midday. While a microscopic morning snack called intaculum existed, it was treated with social indifference and was rarely regarded as a legitimate meal. For centuries across the European continent, this single-meal dominance persisted as the cultural gold standard of civilized conduct. This rigid cultural framework explains why European colonizers experienced profound cognitive dissonance when they first encountered the indigenous populations of the Americas. To the European mind, civilization was defined by adherence to strict boundaries, artificial structures, and predictable routines. When settlers observed the eating habits of Native Americans, they were deeply unsettled by what they perceived as absolute chaos. Indigenous communities did not conform to an arbitrary daily timeline. They fasted when environmental conditions required it, adjusted their nutritional intake to match the shifting seasons, and ate only when true physiological hunger manifested. Because they lacked a fixed, time-locked eating schedule, the European settlers labeled them as uncivilized. This profound cultural bias became an ideological weapon, creating a narrative that synchronized disciplined eating habits were a marker of racial and cultural superiority. This conviction laid the groundwork for the global export of a standardized eating routine. The actual blueprint for our contemporary three-meal structure did not emerge from biological discovery, but from institutional management in 16th century Europe, a world that was rapidly learning to organize itself around the mechanical clock. The British Royal Navy became one of the first massive global institutions to formalize a three-meal daily schedule, maintaining order and maintaining high physical output among thousands of sailors confined to warships required total predictability. Beginning in the 1500s, the Navy implemented a standardized regime that provided 3 specific meals perfectly synchronized with shipboard watch shifts. Through this system, sailors received a rudimentary breakfast of hard ship biscuits and salted meat, a substantial midday lunch acting as the primary fuel source, and a lighter dinner in the evening. The architecture of this schedule was entirely pragmatic. The human machine required fuel at predictable intervals to sustain relentless, grueling physical labor on the high seas. The Industrial Revolution took this institutional experiment and scaled it across the entire globe. Beginning around 1760 in Great Britain and accelerating across Europe and North America over the subsequent century, industrialization fundamentally disrupted the human relationship with time. For thousands of years, the vast majority of the human species worked in agricultural fields, their daily labor expanding and contracting naturally with the seasonal availability of sunlight. The factory system destroyed this organic rhythm. Millions of agrarian workers were pulled into dense urban centers and crammed into manufacturing plants governed by rigid, unyielding clocks. In the factory ecosystem, you did not work until the task was finished or until the sun went down. You clocked in at an exact second, and you clocked out at an exact second. This mechanical environment demanded a completely restructured human biology. To maximize efficiency, factory owners needed to synchronize the biological needs of thousands of workers with the relentless operation of steam-powered machinery. The solution was the creation of the standardized lunch break. Workers were granted a singular, brief window in the middle of the day to consume fuel before returning to the production line. This economic requirement neatly carved the human day into 3 distinct zones. A morning meal became mandatory to survive the initial hours of a grueling 10 to 12-hour shift. A midday meal was required to sustain performance through the afternoon. An evening meal was deferred until after the gates of the factory closed. The 3 meals a day structure was never a medical recommendation for optimal health. It was a mechanical template engineered to ensure that human labor could be seamlessly integrated into the infrastructure of modern industrial capitalism. This socioeconomic shift transformed the cultural meaning of individual meals, most notably breakfast. The word itself reveals its functional history, literally translating to breaking the overnight fast. Throughout medieval Christian Europe, consuming food early in the morning before attending Mass was heavily discouraged, viewed as an indulgence of the flesh that undermined spiritual discipline. Consequently, breakfast as an elaborate daily ritual was incredibly slow to gain widespread acceptance. However, when the Industrial Revolution forced laborers into intense physical exertion at dawn, skipping the morning meal was no longer a matter of spiritual devotion. It became an immediate health hazard. The human body could not sustain industrial productivity on an empty stomach, and thus, breakfast was transformed from a religious taboo into an economic necessity. A similar geographical migration occurred with the evening meal. Prior to the widespread adoption of industrialization, the main, heaviest meal of the day was universally consumed at midday, precisely when natural sunlight was at its peak intensity and cooking fires could be managed safely. As artificial lighting technologies advanced and factory owners extended working hours well into the night, the main meal was forced to migrate. Workers could no longer sit down with their families at noon, meaning the primary anchor of daily life had to be pushed to the late afternoon and evening. By the mid-19th century, dinner after the completion of the working shift had become the psychological and social center of gravity for households across Europe and the United States, cementing the final component of the 3-meal paradigm. By the early decades of the 20th century, the industrial schedule was firmly established, but it required a final commercial intervention to become an unshakable cultural dogma. This momentum was provided by a visionary entrepreneur named John Harvey Kellogg. Operating in an era of rapid urbanization, Kellogg invented cornflakes, conceptualizing it as a clean, processed health food that could cure the rampant indigestion plaguing sedentary office workers. To generate a permanent, self-sustaining market for his invention, Kellogg and the emerging breakfast cereal industry launched some of the most aggressive, sophisticated marketing campaigns in advertising history during the 1920s and 1930s. They saturated newspapers, radio broadcasts, and billboards with a single, highly effective psychological message that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. This assertion was not born from rigorous, peer-reviewed nutritional science. It was born from a commercial imperative. Cereal manufacturing companies needed a mechanism to ensure that millions of citizens felt a profound sense of health anxiety if they failed to purchase and consume their products every single morning. The campaign was an extraordinary success, transforming a corporate sales strategy into an unquestioned medical truth. With this historical understanding, we must confront the ultimate biological paradox. Does your internal physiology actually want you to eat exactly 3 times a day? The answer forces us to look past the mechanical clock and examine our internal cellular architecture. Deep within every human cell resides a molecular timekeeping mechanism known as the circadian rhythm. This internal 24-hour clock is profoundly sensitive to external cues, particularly the presence and absence of natural light. Peer-reviewed research published in prominent scientific journals demonstrates that the precise timing of nutrient ingestion exerts a massive influence on blood glucose levels, insulin sensitivity, metabolic efficiency, and even the genetic expression of adipose tissue. Human biology operates on a highly sophisticated daily curve. In the early hours of the morning, as natural daylight triggers a rise in systemic cortisol, the human body achieves its peak metabolic efficiency. During this specific window, insulin sensitivity is remarkably high, meaning that complex carbohydrates and sugars are rapidly processed and converted into immediate usable cellular energy rather than being deposited as stored fat. If you consume that exact same composition of food late at night, the biological outcome undergoes a destructive shift. Because the circadian rhythm prepares the body for rest and cellular repair during the dark hours, insulin sensitivity plummets. The exact same caloric intake causes blood glucose levels to spike significantly higher, disrupts the production of growth hormones, degrades the architecture of your sleep, and drastically accelerates the storage of visceral fat. Your master metabolic hormones, ghrelin and leptin, which dictate the sensations of hunger and satiety, are not fixed entities. They are highly adaptable evolutionary systems. When you train your body to expect food at precise, recurring intervals, your brain initiates a phenomenon known as physiological food anticipation. Hours before you pick up a utensil, your autonomic nervous system begins adjusting internal body temperature, increasing gastric acid secretion, and modulating insulin levels in direct anticipation of the expected meal. Your body is not experiencing an innate biological emergency when the clock strikes noon. It is simply executing a learned habitual program. This reveals a profound truth. What matters most for human longevity and metabolic health is not an arbitrary number of meals dictated by a corporate or industrial calendar. What matters is alignment with the sun. Whether you choose to consume 2 meals, 3 meals, or 4 meals is ultimately secondary to a much more critical evolutionary law, ensuring that the vast majority of your nutritional intake occurs during daylight hours, when your internal chemistry is evolutionarily optimized to process it. Yet to dismiss the 3-meal structure as a corporate conspiracy or a capitalist trap is to overlook a deeper, beautiful dimension of our shared human narrative. For over 23,000 years, humans have not gathered around hearths and tables simply to ingest calories for survival. We have gathered to establish connection. Long before the invention of factory whistles, naval shifts, or corporate advertising campaigns, the act of breaking bread together was the primary mechanism through which human communities constructed psychological safety, forged deep social bonds, and established systemic trust. Contemporary research in social psychology consistently confirms that individuals who regularly share meals with other human beings report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, stronger support networks, and a deeper, more resilient sense of cultural belonging. The 3-meals-a-day architecture, regardless of its flawed industrial and commercial origins, provides the modern human with 3 recurring, invaluable opportunities every single day to pause, step away from the machine, and engage in a profoundly communal act. We eat 3 meals a day because British sailors required administrative structure on the open ocean. We eat 3 meals a day because 19th century factory owners needed to synchronize human flesh with iron machinery. We eat 3 meals a day because medieval religious institutions regulated the morning stomach, and because 20th century corporate entities recognized that health anxiety could be monetized to sell cardboard boxes of processed grain. Our daily routine is a monument to the history of human engineering, a complex tapestry where religion, economics, industrial discipline, and evolutionary biology have slowly sculpted one another over the course of centuries. Tonight, as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, you will likely sit down to consume your dinner alongside billions of other human beings across the planet. You will do so not because your genes demand it, but because history commanded it. The clock on your wall was designed to serve the efficiency of the market, but the rhythm in your cells was designed to serve the longevity of your life. Now that you understand the hidden architecture of your routine, you are no longer a passive passenger in an engineered timeline. You possess the agency to decide whether your daily habits are serving your biological design or merely serving the industrial machine. How will you restructure your relationship with time and food tomorrow? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.